Philadelphia in 1700 was a city barely 2 decades old, yet already exploding beyond anything its founder William Penn had imagined. 20,000 people packed into a grid of streets where deer had grazed just a generation earlier. This wasn't London, it wasn't Boston, it was something entirely new, a Quaker experiment in religious tolerance that accidentally created America's wealthiest and most sophisticated colonial city. Advanced AI now lets us transform centuries-old engravings into photorealistic scenes, revealing exactly what these muddy streets and brick townhouses actually looked like. The Delaware River waterfront was Philadelphia's lifeline, and in 1750 it pulsed with constant motion. Dozens of merchant ships crowded the wharves, their masts forming a forest along the shoreline. These vessels carried Pennsylvania wheat to the Caribbean, returned with molasses and sugar, then sailed for England loaded with barrel staves and pig iron. The smell hit you first: tar, fish, horse manure, and the sickly sweet scent of raw tobacco being loaded into ship holds. Longshoremen hauled cargo using nothing but rope and muscle, while merchants in silk coats negotiated prices in the counting houses lining Water Street. What made Philadelphia different was its efficiency. Unlike Boston with its tangled medieval lanes, William Penn had designed this city on a rational grid. Streets ran perfectly straight, intersecting at right angles. You could navigate the entire city without getting lost, a revolutionary concept in the 1700s. 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street. The names told you exactly where you were. Between them ran the cross streets: Market, Chestnut, Walnut, named for the trees Penn's surveyors had found growing there. Christ Church rose above the rooftops like a declaration. That steeple, completed in 1754, soared 196 feet, making it the tallest structure in North America. This wasn't just religious architecture. It was a middle finger to anyone who thought colonial America was primitive. Inside, wealthy Anglicans occupied boxed pews they'd purchased for substantial sums, while craftsmen and shopkeepers stood in the back. Benjamin Franklin worshipped here occasionally, though his attendance was spotty at best. George Washington would later occupy Pew 58. But in the 1750s, Christ Church was simply where Philadelphia's elite demonstrated their status every Sunday. Walk 3 blocks west, and you'd find yourself at the State House, though nobody called it Independence Hall yet. That name wouldn't arrive for another century. In 1750, this building housed the Pennsylvania Assembly, where Quaker legislators argued endlessly with the colony's proprietors over taxes and defense spending. The tower held the city's fire bell, which clanged whenever flames broke out, sending volunteer brigades running with their leather buckets. The building was handsome but unremarkable, just another Georgian structure in a city full of them. Market Street was pure chaos every Tuesday and Friday. Farmers drove wagons in from Germantown and the surrounding countryside, setting up stalls before dawn. By mid-morning, thousands of Philadelphians crowded the street, haggling over chickens, inspecting vegetables, and gossiping about their neighbors. The noise was incredible. Vendors shouting prices, geese honking, wagon wheels clattering on cobblestones, and somewhere a fiddler playing for coins. Quaker women in plain grey dresses moved through the crowd alongside indentured servants doing their master's shopping. Occasionally, you'd spot an enslaved African, because yes, Quaker Philadelphia practiced slavery, a contradiction that would eventually tear the community apart. The houses told Philadelphia's story better than any official record. Brick dominated, practical and fireproof, after Londoners learned their lesson in 1666. Wealthy merchants built 3-story townhouses with marble steps imported from England. The front door opened directly onto the street, no front yard, because property taxes were calculated by street frontage. Make your house narrow and deep. Save money. Behind these facades, life unfolded in ways we'd barely recognize. Families of 8 or 10 squeezed into spaces modern couples would consider cramped. Kitchens occupied separate buildings out back to reduce fire risk. Privies sat at the far end of the yard, emptied weekly by night soil men who sold the contents to farmers as fertilizer. Franklin's print shop on Market Street was pumping out newspapers, almanacs, and political pamphlets that shaped colonial thinking. His Pennsylvania Gazette had become the most widely read newspaper in the colonies, mixing news with Franklin's particular brand of practical wisdom. Poor Richard's Almanac sold thousands of copies annually, its maxims about thrift and industry becoming the unofficial philosophy of the emerging American middle class. But Philadelphia wasn't just merchants and Quakers. Germantown, just north of the city, housed hundreds of German-speaking immigrants, Lutherans, Reformed, Mennonites, and others fleeing religious persecution in the Palatinate. These communities maintained their own languages, customs, and churches, creating a cultural complexity that made Philadelphia fundamentally different from ethnically homogeneous New England towns. The city's taverns deserve their own chapter. More than just places to drink, these establishments functioned as community centers, post offices, and informal business exchanges. The London Coffee House at Front and Market became the de facto stock exchange where merchants traded ships' shares and insurance policies. The Indian Queen hosted traveling theatre companies. The City Tavern would later become the unofficial headquarters of the Continental Congress. But in 1750, it was simply where deals got made over Madeira wine and rum punch. What's striking about mid-18th century Philadelphia is how deliberately it was built. Unlike Boston with its tangled medieval lanes or New York's haphazard Dutch origins, Philadelphia followed William Penn's grid. Streets ran straight, intersected at right angles, and bore either numbers or tree names. This rational layout reflected Enlightenment thinking, the belief that reason and planning could create a better society. Penn's vision was explicitly utopian, a holy experiment where religious tolerance and rational urban design would prove humanity's potential. The waterfront along the Delaware was where theory met reality. Massive warehouses stored goods flowing in from the Caribbean, molasses, sugar, rum. Ships arrived carrying enslaved Africans, though Philadelphia's involvement in the slave trade was smaller than Charleston or Newport. The city's Quaker conscience was already stirring, with some members beginning to question whether human bondage contradicted their testimony about the inner light present in all people. These early anti-slavery stirrings would eventually make Philadelphia a center of abolitionist activity, but in 1750 that future remained distant. Christ Church represented Philadelphia's Anglican minority, merchants and royal officials, who found Quaker simplicity too plain. The building's soaring steeple, completed in 1754, would become the tallest structure in North America, visible for miles. Inside, box pews were purchased by wealthy families who treated them like real estate, passing them down through generations. Sunday services were social occasions where you displayed your best clothing and newest imports from London. The contrast with Quaker meeting houses couldn't have been sharper. Friends gathered in plain buildings without steeples, organs, or paid clergy. They sat in silence until someone felt moved by the Spirit to speak. Women spoke as freely as men, a radical equality that scandalized other denominations. No music, no liturgy, no sacraments, just people waiting for God's direct communication. This simplicity extended to their daily lives. Plain clothing, simple furniture, honest business dealings, and that distinctive refusal to remove their hats to social superiors. Education mattered intensely to Philadelphians of all backgrounds. The city had more schools per capita than any other colonial city. Franklin's Academy, founded in 1751, would evolve into the University of Pennsylvania. German immigrants established their own schools to preserve language and culture. Quakers ran schools that taught girls alongside boys, another radical innovation. Even poor children had access to charity schools, though the education they received focused heavily on practical skills and moral instruction rather than classical learning. disease remained the great equalizer. Yellow fever arrived periodically via ships from the Caribbean, killing hundreds before cold weather stopped transmission. Smallpox swept through every few years, leaving survivors pockmarked and immune. Childhood mortality was staggering. Families expected to lose several children before adulthood. The Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in 1751 with Franklin's backing, represented early attempts at systematic medical care, though treatments often did more harm than good. Behind the prosperous merchant facades, poverty existed. Widows struggled without their husband's income. Disabled sailors begged near the docks. Indentured servants endured years of hard labor, legally bound to masters who sometimes treated them brutally. The line between servitude and slavery could blur in practice, though servants at least had contracts with end dates and legal protections, however poorly enforced. Philadelphia's position between North and South gave it unique commercial advantages. Ships from New England brought fish and lumber. Southern plantations sent tobacco and rice. The city's craftsmen, millers, and merchants added value, then re-exported goods to the Caribbean and Europe. This intermediary role generated enormous wealth, visible in the expanding mansions along 2nd and 3rd Streets. Winter transformed everything. The Delaware froze solid some years, halting all shipping. Wealthy families huddled near fireplaces in homes that were impossible to heat adequately. Poor families faced genuine hardship, burning whatever fuel they could afford or gather. The city organized relief efforts, distributing firewood and food to those most desperate early social welfare programs, organized primarily through Quaker charitable networks. By 1750, Philadelphia's population approached 15,000, making it one of the largest cities in the British Empire outside London. More importantly, it had become a place where ideas flourished alongside commerce. Franklin's experiments with electricity, his lending library, his fire insurance company, all represented this distinctly American combination of practical innovation and intellectual curiosity. The city's religious diversity, initially Penn's holy experiment, had created something unprecedented, a place where Quakers, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and others coexisted without constant violence. This wasn't perfect harmony. Tensions simmered, prejudices festered, but people managed to live alongside difference without resorting to the religious wars that had devastated Europe. That grid of rational streets, those brick houses, those contentious assemblies and bustling markets, all of it was building towards something nobody quite anticipated. In just 25 years, this commercial city of pragmatic merchants would become the birthplace of American independence. The ideas percolating in taverns and print shops, the habits of self-governance developed in colonial assemblies, the confidence born from commercial success, all were preparing Philadelphia for a role its founders never imagined. But in 1750, that revolution remained invisible, hidden in the ordinary rhythms of a prosperous colonial port city going about its business. Walking through Philadelphia in the 1750s, you'd have witnessed something genuinely new in human history. A city built on ideas rather than conquest, where religious tolerance wasn't just permitted, but foundational, where a rational street grid reflected Enlightenment thinking made concrete. The contradictions were stark. Quakers preaching equality while owning slaves. Merchants building fortunes while funding libraries and hospitals. A colonial outpost that somehow felt more sophisticated than many European cities. None of these people knew they were building the birthplace of American independence. They were just living their lives, making money, raising families, arguing about taxes. But those tavern debates, those printed pamphlets, that habit of self-governance, all of it was preparing the ground. 25 years later, this pragmatic port city would declare itself the capital of a new nation. The grid of streets William Penn laid out in 1682 would frame the creation of the United States Constitution. Not bad for a Quaker experiment in religious tolerance.